So we're gonna have an update on grants, elections, equipment, review our revenue forecast and budget forecast for the remainder of this year and next year, and talk about next steps beyond that once we review all the information. So thanks everyone for being with us, and John and Avril, I'll turn it over to y'all to get us started.
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to our budget work session. Just to review our timeline, we held our retreat in December. We held a capital work session on March 13th, followed by a work session regarding expenditures on March 28th. We're now here at our revenue estimate work session. In 2 weeks, we will have our final work session in which we will hear from our education partners and those fire districts who are requesting a rate increase. At the May 16th meeting, we intend to provide a recommend budget accompanied by the budget message. We will have a public hearing on the budget on the June 6th meeting and plan for adoption of the budget on June 20th. Today's agenda will begin with discussing what's in your packet. We will have follow-up on grants from our last work session. Our Elections Director, Corinne Duncan, will provide information about the budget request for express vote. We will then dig into our budget portion of the agenda, beginning with a projection of where we expect to finish the current fiscal year, discuss revenues for fiscal year 2024, discuss expenditures for fiscal year 2024, including changes we have made since the first passed budget. We're now calling this the fiscal year 24 second pass budget. We will wrap up with our next steps to include feedback from you on this budget. In your packet, you will find an updated list of position requests with recommendations for positions to be added to the fiscal year 24 budget. Also included is an update from our tax assessment department on progress regarding the recommendations from the ad hoc reappraisal committee. You will find the most recent draft 5-year capital improvement plan with the newly estimated cost of moving front-facing offices to 35 Woodfin. Lastly, you will find the draft fee schedule along with a large 11 by 17 sheet of the actual fee changes and the justification for those fees. So this is a list of the proposed changes, and we have staff here who are available to answer questions regarding those changes if you have them. I'll give you a few minutes to look that over. So if there's no questions on fee changes, I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to excuse folks who came specifically for that purpose. So this is a follow-up from the grant discussion we had at our last meeting. There was a request to see the full year cost as well as the fiscal year 2024 financial impact of these grants, and that is presented here on this slide. 4 grants can be funded with opioid settlement funds to include the Behavioral Health Planning Grant, Jail and Prison Reentry Grant, Mobile Medication Assisted Treatment Grant, and the Safer Together Grant. This will fund 3 county positions and 9 positions through contracted services, as well as providing operating dollars for opioid response. The state will continue to fund the APS Essential Services with ARPA funding in fiscal year 2024. Per the agreement with the Department of Justice, we are required to fund the 3 positions related to the Community-Oriented Policing Grant, and those are currently in the second pass budget. The Family Justice Center grant funding 9 contracted services positions is in the second pass budget. The Public Health Mobile Team is seeking other public health funding sources to sustain that program and is not currently funded in this budget. Are there questions about grants? Okay, Corinne Duncan is here to discuss elections, the elections capital outlay request.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
Thanks for the opportunity to discuss the express vote expansion proposal, and I know you've already reviewed materials on this, so I will make sure to keep this concise. The challenge that we faced is last year, we learned that our vendor would no longer support the machines that we have for early voting, the ballot on demand machines. So we had to make a choice, and we reviewed our options and found that expanding the express vote machine that we already have, we already use this for ADA purposes at all of our voting locations for Election Day and early voting, was the best choice both fiscally and logistically. And it'll also increase accuracy and give better service to voters, and I'll talk in detail about that on the next slide. But the actions that have happened so far have been that staff proposed the expansion to the Board of Elections over 2 public meetings in January, and the board approved that proposal to bring to you all. And that is in accordance with general statute, which requires that the commissioners approve any equipment changes for the voting system.
Do you mind if I ask, why did the company decide they were not going to continue servicing their equipment?
Their printers that the sourcing for those printers became challenging for that company, so they decided to switch to a different type of printer, which meant that they weren't going to serve those printers anymore. And also the toner, the parts to those printers, they can't get those anymore. So they really can't service those printers.
Is there a danger that could happen again?
With that type of system, the ballot on demand system, yes. It's a printer, they have specific parts to those printers. So if we stuck with ballot on demand, it's another consumables cost that is associated with that type of system. Thank you for that question. So some details, the total cost of the project is $604,225, and we would be implementing in October for the municipal election, so that's a smaller election. We would run that, again, it's not a new system. Thank you, Avril. The estimated lifespan is 15 years for this equipment, and it would serve all the early voting locations for all the election types, so the municipalities, the primary, and the general. For voters, it reduces check-in time at the locations, and it increases accuracy by eliminating hand marking mistakes. So sometimes people will mark too many ovals, or they will put a check or an X on the oval. Or sometimes they forget to flip over the ballot. So this will eliminate those factors, which is fantastic. Another bonus is that our precinct reported results, instead of being available 30 days after the election, they'll be available immediately. So we'll have those results on election night with the rest of the unofficial results. Let's talk about what is express vote and what is the application of express vote that we're proposing. So at its essence, it's a pen. Voters use it to mark their paper ballot. It's not a tabulator. It does not replace the paper ballot. All auditing procedures remain unchanged. So we can talk about the voter experience. When they check in, they'll be issued a paper ballot that looks like this. It's a piece of paper. And the voter will then take their ballot to a voting booth, and instead of a pen being there, the express vote machine will be there. They'll insert the ballot into the machine, and they'll make their selections on the screen. Then they'll be prompted to review it electronically. And once they're happy with those selections, they'll print it, and then they can review their selections. They can read it on the ballot, just like we will. Then they'll take the ballot to the tabulator just as they do now and receive their coveted I voted sticker. That's how the voters will interact with express vote. So we think that it's a very simple system, safe, and it's proven. We use it in Buncombe, and 11 other counties use it across the state, including Mecklenburg, who uses it for early voting and election day, so they use it for all in-person voting. It's certified by the State Board of Elections. It's vetted by the Buncombe County Board of Elections and supported by Buncombe County IT Director. As we discussed earlier, the commissioners approved it for ADA purposes 4 years ago. And it's easy setup for poll workers. We also have someone on staff who has implemented this in another county, so we have in-house knowledge for implementing it. And it reduces paper consumption by half. It's smaller, it also costs less. And then a great benefit of Express Vote is that all those ADA capabilities that we use it for now are accessible to everyone. So the site, hearing, all the tactile enhancements are available to anybody who votes early. We set a demo video that I hope was helpful. Are there any other questions? Thank you.
All right, thanks so much.
That's correct. So now we're going to talk about projections. These projections are based on the month-end March actuals and our expectations about spending and revenue generation for the remaining quarter of the year. To recap our fiscal year 2023 budget, we are looking at our amended budget as of April 17th, 2023. This excludes changes made at our April 18th meeting, which totaled $200,000 in parking services, revenue, and expenditures. Our budgeted expenditures total $408.9 million and $386 million in revenues. To balance the budget, we budgeted appropriate fund balance and the amount of $15.8 million. In September, we appropriated an additional $5.2 million for obligations for goods and services that were not received in fiscal year '22. And in February, we transferred $1.8 million to the capital fund per the fund balance policy. This totals $22.9 million of appropriated fund balance. We are projecting revenues of $390.9 million, which is $4.9 million more than we budgeted. $4.1 million of this excess is through property tax, much of which is registered motor vehicles and interest on property taxes. Sales tax is down about $1.1 million from our budget. Reminder that our sales tax receipts lag by 3 months, so this projection is based only on our receipts for the year through January. Intergovernmental revenue is coming in $1.4 million over budget, mostly due to a $3 million excess in Medicaid hold harmless payment. Sales and service is up $2.3 million, largely due to ambulance revenue and planning fees coming in high, while permits and fees contributes about $500,000 over budget. We had budgeted a transfer from the medical insurance fund of $1.5 million, which we will not make given the strength of these revenues. Expenditures are projected at 95.4% of budget at a total of $390.2 million. From the graph depicted here, you see that we are projecting salaries and benefits to be underspent by $9.9 million, program support underspent by $3.5 million, and operating underspent by $2.9 million. Given the projections of $390.9 million in revenues and the $390.2 million in expenditures, this is about $600,000 more revenue than expenditures and results in contribution of that amount to fund balance. Are there any questions regarding projections for the current fiscal year? So we're going to talk about expenditure changes since first pass. Since the last time we met, we reviewed the list of recommended positions and cut 22 positions, as well as staggered some start dates of new positions to begin later in the fiscal year, which saved $3.5 million. We have reduced the salary budget to account for lapsed salary, as we know we will not be 100% staffed. This results in a reduction of $9.1 million. We looked at requested operating department budgets and reduced those budgets by $4.7 million. As discussed before, grants moved to the opioid settlement fund totaled $1.1 million. We worked with our finance department and reduced anticipated debt service due to later issuance, and this resulted in $2.7 million. All told, we have reduced expenditures by $21.1 million from the first pass budget.
John, could you say a little bit more about the item salary budget to account for lapse?
So we know that we're not 100% staffed at any given time. So rather than budget 100% of salaries and know that we're going to give some back because there is lapsed salary, because there are people who aren't here and in positions, we're not going to budget the full 100% of salaries. We're budgeting about 94% of salaries based on historical lapse. And so that accounts for us reducing the salary and benefits budget by $9.1 million.
So just as sort of forecasting over the course of the year, around 6% of positions typically that are in the budget won't be actually paid.
Potentially.
That is our recent history of our turnover and the struggles we're having with her and staff right now. So instead of budgeting 100%, we're budgeting at about that 94, 95%.
Any other questions on this?
And have we done that in past years? Is that?
We did do that this year. We budgeted about $4.5 million less, so that accounted to about 98% this year. So we have cut a little deeper for next year based on what I showed you on the prior slide, how we're underspending the salary budget this year.
And was this year the first year that those kind of assumptions started getting embedded in around lapsed salary?
Yes.
Okay. Seems like a good practice because it's a big number. Okay, great.
So this brings us to the total of budgeted expenditures for the fiscal year '24 second pass budget. Our expenditures total $425.4 million with salaries and benefits at $182.6 million. Program support, which includes education, is budgeted at $139 million. Operating expenditures are budgeted at $63.9 million. Debt service is budgeted at $21 million. Transfers and other financing are budgeted at $13.5 million. Capital outlay is budgeted at $4.5 million, and we have budgeted contingency at $1 million. So looking at the comparison with the fiscal year '23 amended budget by function, the overall increase in expenditures is 4.1% more than the current year. This is your budget by function. As the number one priority set at our December budget retreat, public safety sees an increase of $6.9 million. Are there any questions about the second pass expenditures as presented?
So we have $1 million for contingency. Any thoughts you would share on that? I mean, in a way, I kind of think about our unallocated fund balance is sort of all contingency in a way, right? The funds that we have available to spend on things, something happened that we weren't forecasting. So in addition to the unallocated fund balance, there's sort of this $1 million that we're not planning to spend but could spend. So how do y'all think about that number?
I think it's low. But quite honestly, when we do the budget, we can't spend contingency unless we come back to you. And that is for those unforeseen things. We had it when we did COVID. We were able to use our contingency. You gave us the option to use that money right out the bat without touching and looking at fund balance. We've had it again when we had the Hurricane Fred, or Tropical Storm Fred. when we were able to come to you and said, give us some funds, set aside this money so we can start right away addressing the needs in our community. So that's what we use contingency for. We have not looked to use it from fund balance and appropriate fund balance. We've always tried, we have that as a secondary safety net, but we've always looked at that contingency number as opportunity to quickly deploy and start working on items.
As well, I believe that in prior years, a lot of departments had contingency baked into their departmental budgets. And we have worked with departments over the last couple of years to ensure that any contingency is here at the county level, so that if departments do run over budget, then they might look for contingency from us. So we really have reduced operating budgets to just what they need to operate, as opposed to historical padding budgets or putting money in some budget line where you might not spend it and just want to hold on to it.
And I'm just curious, so why do we move the pre-K funding from education into other financing sources this year?
So we are going to transfer those dollars, similar to what we do with conservation easements and affordable housing. We're going to take those dollars and put them in Fund 224, our Special Projects Fund, which is a multi-year fund, so that in the case that there are unspent funds at the end of the year, they will be able to be utilized in the future year.
And I believe that's also a recommendation coming from were you going to say that, Commissioner?
No, you go ahead and then I'll follow.
Yes. So the pre-K committee has recommended that the money, if they don't allocate it, this year they had some shortages in staff and they couldn't spend all their money. That means if it stays in the education fund, it would fall back to general fund. So they're asking that that money be set aside, similar to we do for affordable housing or we do for conservation easement, that money can be set aside in a multi-year fund.
Yeah, just to provide a tiny bit more context, again, when the fund was established, it didn't have that multi-year structure around it. So since fiscal year 20, about $541,000 has been returned and rolled back into the general fund. And we're looking at probably about $145,000 that is poised to be returned this year. As County Manager Pinder said, it's factors often related to sort of hiring cycles. And then if you can't hire for a classroom, you can't open the classroom. So sometimes there's associated costs. And at our last committee, our last committee meeting, the Early Childhood Committee voted to bring forth a recommendation to us to convert this to a multi-year fund, and also in doing that to specify that the committee could bring forward recommendations around how to spend return funds, which could include, building out sort of a secondary cycle within the 12-month period, kind of similar to what we've seen with affordable housing, where proposals can come forward at different times.
What we're finding, the big problem we have in early childhood is getting qualified people. And that's why we've got to work with Buncombe Tech and other schools to make sure we can beef up our training. Because in several instances, Emma, we opened a state-of-the-art facility there. But I'm not sure we're up to capacity yet because we don't have the trained personnel. And that's what doing this will give us some flexibility and to take advantage, in the future.
And process-wise, that would come forward at the time that we vote on the budget ordinance, is that correct?
Yes, we have two ordinances. We have the annual budget ordinance and we have the capital ordinance. The capital ordinance covers multi-year funds. So not only does it cover the capital funds, the opioid settlement fund is also in that ordinance. The special projects fund is in that ordinance. And so we would appropriate based on, at that time, in that ordinance.
Okay, great. And I think I never ever do math in public. I got that number slightly wrong. The past amount of return funds was about $386,000, and then we're poised to have another $145,000 this year. So just want to correct myself.
So since the item is being discussed, if there's a different decision from the board as to leave it as is, we need to know that. If not, the intent would be to move it forward as the recommendation is.
I guess the only other question I had is whether there's any mechanism to through which that 380,000 could be restored to the fund. Okay, Brownie says no. Okay, it's worth asking.
Good, great try, great try.
Now what we've proposed seems so moderate
Hang
and
on.
measured.
I wanted to ask the question, but I knew the answer.
That money's been spent.
Okay, if there's no further questions about expenditures, we're going to move on to revenue. In our second pass budget, you see property tax as usual, the largest revenue source here at $250.4 million. This is 4% growth over last year. We are budgeting sales tax at $48.9 million in revenue, around 5% over our projection for this year. Intergovernmental revenue is budgeted at $51.6 million. Sales and services at $22.2 million. Transfers are budgeted at $7 million. Other taxes and licenses are budgeted $11.3 million, much of which is Register of Deeds excise tax. Permits and fees are budgeted at $5.4 million, while other revenues are budgeted at $4.9 million. So comparing our fiscal year '24 revenue to the fiscal year '23 amended budget, we see the largest increase in revenue is property tax, seeing an increase due to natural growth of $10.1 million. Intergovernmental revenue increases by $2.2 million. Sales tax rises by a modest $1.4 million. Sales and services sees an increase of $4.3 million. I'll be discussing some drivers on the next slide. Transfers are decreased by $5.4 million. We see approximately $200,000 in additional permits and fees revenue. The increase of $2.7 million in other revenues is bond proceeds from going out to debt for vehicles this year. Overall, this is a 4.1% increase in revenue.
And the 1.4 million, that reflects the, 5% increase forecasted on the sales tax?
Yes, and I'll have a slide to go on sales tax in detail. To dig into some of the drivers impacting our revenue changes, here you see a list of departments in which there is an increase or decrease of $100,000 or more in revenue. Our largest increase in revenue in departments is ambulance revenue, increasing that revenue budget by almost $2 million. Tax collections revenue is driven by the 5% collection fee for occupancy tax collection. Health and Human Services sees an increase of $1.2 million, mainly due to increased Medicaid revenue. Permits budget's almost $600,000 more to follow the continued trend of increasing volume. Planning will see an increase due to larger volume of stormwater and erosion control fees. On the other side, 911 operations sees reduced revenue as the cost share with smaller municipalities has come to an end. Register of Deeds is seeing a slowdown in excise tax revenue, and this is a reduction of $529,000, though half of this would be passed through to the state. Any questions specifically about these?
Will Medicaid expansion affect Health and Human Services any, or do we know at this point?
It will affect us. And so we're still waiting on the state to pass their budget. We do know that if we do need to expand in staff, the state has tacitly said that they will cover additional costs in the first couple of years of that expansion so that we shouldn't see a county cost. But we have not heard the details of that yet.
And then 911, where we have the loss from municipalities. Now, if I remember right, when we discussed this, we said at some point we would get more revenue from the state. Is that kicking in?
We expect to do that. Our 911, our Public Safety Communications Director is working with I think he has a contract to work with the company to explore how we draw down the maximum revenue from the state. We have not drawn down a lot of revenue from the state because we have held on to too much fund balance in our 911 fund. And so the state decides that if you have held on to too much fund balance, then they will not distribute more monies. So we're exploring ways to upgrade facilities, and he's exploring ways to draw down more revenue in that fund, in that fund.
Explain something. You said fund balance in 911 fund. Is that separate from our overall fund balance?
So we take the state funding for 911, and yes, that is in a separate fund.
Okay.
So in the general fund, our personnel costs and most of our operating are in the general fund for 911. But any of the state funding, we keep in a separate fund that is budgeted annually, but does have fund balance if we don't spend all the funding.
What is the revenue associated with school resource officers?
So there was, the sheriff did not budget school resource officer revenue in this current year. And so he has had some discussions with the schools, and this is the revenue agreement they've come to for fiscal year '24.
Did you have a question still on the 911 piece? Okay.
The schools pay a portion of their salaries to support. They can't fund it's really passed through from the state money to the schools, who then give it to us.
Is it really pass through of state funding or also county funding?
That's all state funding that's given to us, that passed to the schools and passed then to us. We do have to, that doesn't cover the full cost of school resource officers. It covers about $33,000 per position. It also doesn't cover the operating associated with school resource officers, such as their uniforms, their equipment, and their vehicles.
There's state funding that specifically must be spent on SROs. So the schools receive that, and then they pass it back through to the sheriff's
The
office.
schools have to actively apply for it.
All right. Is Parker zoomed into the meeting? Okay, I know he's out of town. Okay, but he's watching the meeting on Facebook? Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't think to ask that at the beginning of the meeting, but there's a way he can observe the meeting. Okay,
Sorry. I just said that he said that he's watching it via Facebook, but
Okay.
he won't be able to speak.
all right, thanks, I just want to make sure there's a way he could hear the information.
He's telling us that Parker didn't notify us ahead of time, so that's why it says not a Zoom link. We didn't have the Zoom ready.
But we're broadcasting.
He's on
it
Facebook watching,
there.
yes.
Okay, great. Very good.
Any more questions about this particular slide? So property tax revenue is based on the tax rate per $100 of total property value and multiplied by the collection rate. By statute, we cannot budget a collection rate that exceeds the actual rate of the year prior. While we budgeted 99.65% of collections in fiscal year '23, we received 99.75% in fiscal year '22 and are confident that will occur again this year. So that is the amount we are budgeting this year, and we will continue to assess this rate prior to adoption. So sales tax revenue, recalling that this revenue lags by 3 months, this is the most difficult revenue stream to forecast and budget. While we budgeted 10% over our forecast for fiscal year '22 in this year's budget, it appears we will come up short on this. The budget for fiscal year '24 is set at a modest 5% increase over our projection. This increase is more in line with pre-pandemic year-over-year changes. And Article 46 tax is presented for your reference, and this tax funds operating and capital projects for AB Tech. Any questions about sales tax?
Recognizing it's hard to predict, nobody's got a crystal ball, but I mean, there is a lot of, conjecture that there could be a mild recession later this year. So if there is, would this likely be overly optimistic if that does occur? If this is sort of more, typical increase when you don't have a recession, if you do have a mild recession, then
It's hard to say. The state has collected sales tax differently since the last recession, so we don't really have a lot of information on how sales tax now compares to it back in the 08-09 recession. There was a dip in sales tax revenue year over year at that time. So while 2 years ago, we projected 15% above the prior year, and then this year, 10% above the prior year, we've moved down to 5%, and which is generally around the average we saw for the several years pre-pandemic. So if there were to be a recession, potentially, this is optimistic, but we really haven't seen that much of a slowdown in purchasing.
So we didn't go aggressive on this because of the fears in our economy right now. We did go to that 5%, which is historically what we have seen. And John mentioned the state is collecting sales tax differently. What that means is they're now taxing more services. So people still have services versus just the regular goods that they would purchase before. So we feel that this 5% puts us in line to weather that recession should that come.
That leaves us with $401.9 million in revenues and $425.4 million in expenditures. Are there any questions there?
And of course, we still have our education partners and the fire districts coming. So this is just based on what we know at this point.
Correct, and we do still have baked in that, is it 10 million?
$10 million.
$10 million for education partners. So that is our baseline that we have budgeted in this budget. When they do come on the 9th and they change and you do something different, then we would need to adjust.
the 10 million's embedded within the 425 million.
Correct.
Yes. Yes, this is, just as a recap, we discussed this last time, but this is education year over year. And the agreement we made in 2019 to increase per the unrestricted revenue rate year over year. And you can see, with the exception of 2020, you have contributed more than that rate to the schools. The $10 million does reflect a 10.3% increase over last year.
We wanted to show this quick slide because we really didn't discuss it last time. So what we have, what I call above the line are the ones that we've been funding that are kind of baked in. The new items on the bottom, I believe we have a new request. Parker's not here, Brownie, so I'm going to go to you and Terry. The Clean Water Fund, that was brought forward by Commissioner Wells. And then I think I got an email recently from Parker about another $100,000 for the Green Bank. So if you guys want to speak to that, that 100,000 is not in the numbers yet. We would need to get consensus to go ahead and move that one forward.
Sure. So the Energy and Environment Committee has been working on a number of different issues this year, but two of the main items that we've really been focused on is research around water quality issues in Buncombe County. We've spent a lot of time looking at, all the different programs that are out there, from the nonprofit environmental community to the state environmental agencies, and all the work that they do around water quality monitoring and protection in Buncombe County. And thinking about this question of, well, there's a lot of different actors in this arena. And the county has a role too, of course, in our planning and zoning. We regulate development, so to prevent, runoff and things like that into creeks and rivers. But what could we do to make a meaningful difference in terms of improving water quality in Buncombe County? Part of what we kind of came away from is that, there's been a lot of really good planning work done around different watersheds in Buncombe County, but there hasn't been the resources in place all the time to actually implement these really good plans. And so part of our thinking is, well, let's put some funding towards actually implementing these well thought out plans that are out there. For one of the watersheds is the Swananoa River watershed. Cane Creek is another one. So anyway, it's it's a pretty modest recommendation. I mean, we're not going to fully implement all these ideas just with this level of funding, but it would allow us to kind of start contributing towards and sort of being a partner in implementing some of the kind of low-hanging fruit types of our already identified projects. So we felt like that was a very good bang for the buck for the county to kind of get involved in that way. And that's the sort of the centerpiece of the water quality piece. Terry, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, and part of that, we had several meetings on this with lots of discussion around this topic. Part of this also really allows leveraging, so those partner organizations to pull in a lot more funding with this small amount of funding. And 100,000 of it was specifically for that water fund. And then I think it's the other 42 is specifically our Buncombe County Soil and Water with their their cost share program that they're pulling in for the state. The 42,000 was to help with that program as well, so that they can be able to do more of those cost share programs. So that was, I think that hits the highlights of the Clean Water Fund. And of course, we can answer questions if you have any questions around that. Green Bank?
And then the other, the other idea we've really spent a lot of time looking at this year, of course, we've done a lot of work to think about energy efficiency, renewable energy on our own county-owned buildings and our education partners that we're responsible for their facilities. But also, so thinking about, well, what can we do to make a bigger difference out in the larger community? We've set clean energy, renewable energy goals for our public sector, but also for the larger community. And we've been focused on our own facilities, but wanting to think about how do we make a bigger difference out in the larger community. And so one of the really compelling ideas that's coming forward, and really this is sort of a national idea, and it's a program that's going to be strongly supported through the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act last fall, which invested in lots of different clean energy incentives and programs. But there's funding specifically to create what's referred to as a National Green Bank Initiative, which will then be kind of administered at the state level. So there's a group of people working on development of this North Carolina, I think they're calling it the North Carolina Clean Energy Fund, also known as the North Carolina Green Bank. And the basic idea is this will create a financing platform to help families and businesses to be able to finance all of these great new clean energy technologies that are becoming available in the marketplace, from electric vehicles to renewable energy to high efficiency heat pumps, and all these different kind of really great new, well, in some cases new, in some cases more improved clean energy technologies. But to make sure people of all financial backgrounds and businesses can afford to invest in these kind of great technologies that are needed to move towards a clean energy economy. And the main federal funds are not going to become available for probably 18 to 24 months, because all these programs are being developed. So the people working on developing the North Carolina Green Bank want to do a pilot project with one or two communities in North Carolina to basically kind of get a program on the ground, learn from it, and just kind of show how this can work. And so they are interested in partnering with Buncombe County on this pilot project. So, and we are interested in partnering with them so that we can also kind of learn about this, gain some experience with it on a small scale in preparation for what's likely to be a much larger scale and robust platform, and really probably one of the main vehicles that will be put in place to help accelerate this transition to clean energy. So it's, again, relatively modest amount of funding, but we think it will be very valuable to gain that experience in preparation for what's going to be this large-scale program coming up in the next couple of years. So it's kind of the short version.
Yeah, and I think it well positions us and our community to really be able to take advantage of this additional funding that will be coming. And also just to bring more awareness to the community about all the different technologies that will be available, whether it's the heat pumps, the hot water heaters, all the, as well as the renewables and all that they already know about. But I think this is going, that very small amount, because that's a loan loss reserve that then actually will allow the banks to have about $1 million that they'll be able to invest?
That's right. The North Carolina Clean Energy Fund staff believe that our investment of $100,000 to create this loan loss reserve, it's very similar to like the small business lending vehicle that we've partnered with here at the local community level. The $100,000 for a loan loss reserve will allow the creation of this pilot project with over $1 million of funding from a credit union or banking partner that they would be working through to implement this. And it does have this kind of, like the pilot project, and I think the larger green bank, in addition to all the clean energy benefits, it does have this kind of strong focus on community equity and how basically, for very affluent folks, electric vehicles, solar energy, it's great stuff. But the question is, how do you make this accessible to people from all kind of financial backgrounds? So a lot of it's focused on kind of opening up this market to working families and smaller businesses in the community as the primary kind of clients of who would work through the Green Bank. So, all right, that's our story. So yeah, we want to recommend. The committee voted at our last meeting to. We'd already voted for the Clean Water initiative, and we voted to recommend inclusion of the Green Bank pilot project in our budget this year, if possible. So that's the recommendation of the committee. Any questions about any of that?
So does that mean a consensus to add $100,000 to the budget for the Green Bank? Is that a yes? Thank you.
I would be in support of it too, because that will put us in a good position when the real money starts kicking in, so to speak. Yeah, and we.
Also supportive.
Thank you.
Great, appreciate it. All right, John, did you have other items up there we needed to check in on too?
That's our last slide. So now is open conversation. Anything in there? There is go back to the revenue size. There's a gap on, is that 24? Right around 23, 24 million? Is there a gap right now between revenues and budgeted expenditures? I am pretty comfortable with about 17 to 19 max on budgeted fund balance, which leaves us about a $4 to $6 million gap of expenditures over revenues that we need to address. If you want us to go work on that and bring it back a balanced budget, I would like to do that once we hear from the schools and what you guys decide to do on schools. So we have what is our final gap then from schools?
And when you say a balanced budget, again, in your mind, that would be within a forecasted fund balance appropriation more in the 17 to 19 million neighborhood?
Right.
Okay. I mean, because any of it's technically balanced, right? Because we're just going to say we're appropriating fund balance to balance the budget, but you think realistically it's going to be
Correct.
more likely to be balanced
At the 17 to 19
if it's in that
max.
neighborhood. Okay. Well, I would say, yes, definitely, if that's, the neighborhood that you think we need to get into, then, I would be supportive of, further work on this. So, and I assume a lot of that's around how this gets phased in over the course of the year, right? So, but I would encourage that. The one other issue I wanted to talk about a little bit, this was in one of the pieces of information that staff circulated, was the question around the living wage policy and how much additional funding would be needed to get the county to get all of our employees to a living wage. Based on the inflation changes, I mean, this is a number that's grown quickly with inflation, right? So it's part of all that. So thank you for going into some more detail around that question. I'm pulling up the memo right now. So the staff's analysis is that there's, with the current cost of living adjustment, it would only require an additional $129,000 to get the county to there's 66 employees, 64 employees that would still be below the living wage standard under the currently proposed budget.
Well, the positions, not all of those positions are currently filled.
Oh, so it would be even less than that.
It would, if you're if you're assuming those positions are filled, then that's what the cost is. We'd need to look and see how many of those positions are part-time positions. They're not full-time positions.
Okay. So the 129,000, so there's 64 positions, but though not all are currently filled, that would fall below that. And do you know how many of those are full-time positions or part-time positions?
I want to say it's roughly half and half. Last time I looked at it, about 33 or 35 are part-time.
And remind me, what is our policy around the living wage policy? If somebody is it 30 hours a week or 20 hours a week? Like, where do we apply it? Because there's some positions that are part-time that we don't apply the policy to. Is that correct, or am I not correct in that?
The only positions we did not apply the policy to were our pages, the bookshelvers, but beyond that, every position was
Regardless of how many hours a week?
correct.
Okay. Well, I guess I would, I know that with the inflation this year, this doing cost of living is a big lift, and the one I'm supportive of. But, I mean, I would like to have as the goal that we get here, and I'm happy to kind of be somewhat flexible in the timing of how we do that, and not saying we have to be there on the first day of the new fiscal year, but I would like to have, the goal that to get 100% of our employees to the living wage standard. So I'll speak up for that. And I understand that there's compression issues that go along with that. So anyway, but I'm supportive of continuing to look at that. And I know with that, in the memo, it talks about how the 911 center, the detention center officers, a lot of the other positions that would be affected by the inflation are also positions that we're really struggling with retention on. So, I mean, in a way, kind of focusing on doing some more in those areas seem like something that we need to be doing anyway. And I think we will be doing more to try to address the compensation for those folks so that we improve retention and to attract more employees to fill the vacancies, right?
One thing that is in the budget, and I know the sheriff would probably be reaching out on this, he'd ask about an additional $3 for the detention officers and sworn officers. We did include the $3, but my compromise, which I'm not sure we have agreement on, but my position of what's in this budget is first you apply the COLA. And if there's a difference for folks, then you get the additional to get to 3. So it's inclusive of the COLA to get to 3. It is not $3 on top of the COLA.
On top of the COLA.
So that is in here for those detention officers and his sworn officers. But we can.
The $3 is in there, but including the inflation.
Correct, correct. We will take a look at that $20.10 to make sure all of our positions are there. I do want to look at that compression that would happen if we don't address compression. So give us some time to go back and take a look at that. But knowing that that's your goal, we can work towards that.
Fair enough.
I did just want to make sure we had thoroughly closed the loop on that recommendation from the Early Childhood Committee. Do we need to do a sort of consensus thing like we just did with the Green Bank? Formally get that noted, or are we good?
Yes, I actually got head nods on that one.
Okay, I thought I saw head nods. I just want to make sure we're,
So-
to
To call it out,
clarify
I just
that,
want to make sure.
145 is the amount that we know will be returned at this point. There may be additional funds, so the premise
Right.
is that the returned funds can be rolled back into the fund and redeployed starting July 1. Is there support on, I'd love to hear what folks' thoughts are on that.
Remember, we started out with 3 votes and we picked up one.
Yeah, I saw at least one very firm head nod, yeah.
Um, uh, We're good on the current year money starting to roll is what you're
I
asking
didn't
for
see head
versus
nods on
starting.
my more
I didn't,
radical proposal.
right, I didn't. I did see clear consensus on starting July 1 that we rolled it all and it never falls
Right.
out. But I want to make sure that we're clear on current year, the 100,000 or so that you think is going to be left over.
The floor seems to be about 145,000, but there may be more,
Could be more, yeah.
yeah.
That we want to make sure that that rolls into next year. So instead of a 2.3, we get 2.4. That amount would be rolling over.
It's the 3.9.
It's 3.9. Oh, I'm sure. So it becomes a $4 million pot come July, is
Right.
what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm supportive of that. But you were talking previously about like previous years.
I mean, I just
Right,
floated
like
it. It was a,
that's-
it was a, it was
We-
a
we
thought
know
balloon.
That lead
Not going
balloon, she
back
was
and
trying to
forth.
float a lead balloon there.
No, but the thing I do want to hear, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about, is rolling over this year's return funds. And that the other piece, just to make sure, again, we're being very thorough, is that the committee's recommendation was that that returned bucket could be deployed at other points in the fiscal year. It would bring forth a recommendation to us.
Right.
Okay, great. Awesome, thank you all.
And do we, I don't know, like on the Affordable Housing Services Program, is it a written policy that those funds automatically recycle? Or has that just been kind of the working assumption, so it's just sort of been that way and that's how we've done it?
Those are in the multi-year fund, so those are already in the multi-year fund.
I'm not
so
sure if it's written or not, though, but it has been working that way from
They're
day one.
placed into a
I
budget
brought a budget
category
amendment.
that is recurring.
Yes, I
Correct.
brought a
or,
budget
rollover.
amendment to move those unspent funds into this year's.
So if we approve that for the early childhood education as well, that will remain the case unless
Yes.
some future staff and commission change the budget category as well.
We
So
currently
don't-
do
I guess my question is, do we need to like formally adopt a policy at a commission meeting to kind of say this is the policy?
No, I think that's already been set by the accounting records. I'm not sure why when that one happened, that didn't happen, but it works for conservation easements and it works for affordable housing. For some reason, it was an annual calculation for that. So the other two are already set that way.
All right.
Was there a conversation on transit? Did you want to?
To talk about transit?
The transit feasibility study, is that something we want to discuss today?
Today would be preferred, so, because we, yes, ma'am. If there's any questions on it, today would be preferred.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit. We may not, come to a conclusion necessarily, but we can talk about it. So there's been a couple of different numbers talked about on this, ranging from 300, just on the county's contribution, 300,000, 200,000, other numbers have been talked about. So Avril, what is the staff's current?
$200,000 is currently in this budget.
200.
200,000.
Okay, and the city was requesting 300,000, or proposing that each organization do 300,000. The county's currently saying if we did this, 200,000 is the number that's programmed.
And in our last conversation with the city, I think we agreed that 200 would be where we would target, would be a $400,000 study. Because we don't have quotes yet, and when we go for quotes and so something changed, then we will try to split it evenly at that point as well.
Can we review the purpose of the feasibility study and the
Yes.
outcomes we expect?
Yep, and I know Matt and Sybil are here, so I'll ask Matt. Is Matt the one? He might not be prepared to talk about it, but he will be.
We can do this whenever is, okay.
He's been deep into working on the scope.
All right, so the scope is kind of in development, so that's part of why an exact budget would be difficult to determine, and why numbers have been higher and then have been adjusted. So the things that we are looking at, I think the county's interest and part of the scope would be to look at the governance structure, whether we move forward as two separate systems, adjust how we operate together, or if some kind of joint system for all or part of the services would make sense. That would be a major component of interest in this type of a scope. Also looking at how we might collaborate, again, between the two entities, either in a joint or separate structure. Service delivery and service design would be an important component. So part of the scope would be assessing existing conditions. Obviously, that's most studies include that. To assess what is working well and what could be improved. A look at capital, just our assets, and making sure what we have is right-sized for the system. There are other components that may become options. So that's part of the discussion, is what is necessary and what might be an option of interest to, either the city or county. So those could be built as options in a scoping exercise. But really also a major component is the financial aspect. So again, regardless of governance structure and everything that comes out as a recommendation, what is the financial implication to the systems to provide a service or expand a service, as well as to combine certain aspects of the systems, under different governance structures. And that can be a costly part of a scoping as well. So any of those financial kind of analysis pieces. But we are really emphasizing governance and emphasizing the financial components, because it is important, any kind of recommendations that you understand the financial feasibility of undertaking those.
And the other piece that we've been asking about was, you mentioned it briefly, was operations. The actual system, what we have on the ground, how do we scale that up? Do we have delivery so we have more frequency of buses? How do we increase ridership? Those kind of just operational questions we've been asking to get scoped in this as well.
So Avril and the city manager and the mayor and I have, periodic meetings where we talk about different issues the city and the county are working on together. So in our most recent meeting, we talked about this a fair amount. So I'll just kind of share a couple thoughts. I've been supportive of the idea of doing this study and the idea of really looking at, should we create a joint transit system for Asheville and Buncombe County as the Asheville area continues to grow and urbanize, but because of state laws, the city limits are not changing. The city limits are not growing organically along with the population growth and the urbanization of our area. So as the main, as the largest transit service provider in Western North Carolina, the city is, of course, the city taxpayers are funding the services within the city limits. But over time, that will be an increasingly kind of arbitrary kind of limitation on the service delivery for transit in our area. So for all these different reasons, I felt like, for the future, looking at some kind of joint system really is a pretty good idea. My sense from the conversations with the city is that their primary interest in doing this joint transit study was in the hopes of sort of building momentum around passage of a new sales tax as a revenue source to invest in transit, right? So state law allows counties to do referendums to increase the sales tax to fund transit. And, Mecklenburg County, some of the really big urban counties have done this, right? And I think the city would love to do that here. But it's an idea that, there hasn't been much conversation about at the county-wide level. And, in my feedback to the to the city officials was that, I'm sort of skeptical that would be supported at the county-wide level, just because, we're not Mecklenburg County or Wake County, where a very high percentage of our residents live in areas that would be served by transit. A lot of our residents live in much lower population density areas, rural areas, areas that wouldn't be served by transit. So it might be a much harder pitch to raise taxes on everyone for a service that like a lot of folks would not realistically be using. And I think as those conversations have been had, I think they've kind of recognized that this is not in any way kind of like, hey, we do this study, leads to passage of a sales tax. Like that may never happen, or it may be years and years into the future. So, so part of my sense is that, with the recognition that additional funding for transit's more likely to be appropriated by the city of Asheville and Buncombe County, like those, as part of our budget process, that's where funding would likely come from in the near term, if we're going to improve transit. And with all these other competing demands that we have on our budget, we do, and so does the city, the amounts of additional funding that we could appropriate for this purpose, are probably modest, With all that said, I mean, my sense from the city is that if we're not going to have some major new funding source, that there's not a lot of enthusiasm for creating a joint system at the city level, unless, if it's something we're operating that looks a lot like what we're operating today. That was part of my sense from the feedback from the city manager. Would you share that? Or my concern is that we're going into this transit study maybe not at all with a shared sense of what the goals of this study would be.
And we can talk about that scope a little bit more to make sure that we're all aligned. I do feel that they have pulled back a little bit from the revenue sales tax conversation about this study and more about operations. When we talked last, they were also focused on operations and how do we drive ridership and how do we make it more attractive and how do we roll out more capital investments. So I think they were looking at it more broadly than just on the revenue side.
But not very interested in the governance changes was my sense. I mean, there's, the city manager said, why would we form an authority if we're just running something that looks like what we have, a system of the size that we have today? So if that's one of our main interests, but it's not of very much interest to the city, I'm just kind of concerned that we don't have a shared purpose for why we're doing this.
Brownie, the concern I have, and from living in the city and on the bus line, but, I shouldn't have to drive down here, especially during the day for meetings. And I've looked at the bus schedule, and just to get to this meeting here this morning, I would waste most of the day because of the way the schedule is. I hope if we do a study, we don't base it on just looking for taxes. We look at how we're going to serve our constituents. And if we're not serving us here in the city, we're sure not doing anything for the people in the county. But that's what I hope is a true study will show how we can do it and how we can, sure, I want to see us balance the budget, because I don't think the city buses have made any money during my lifetime that I can think of. But, let's do a true study. I mean,
Well, I guess my other question, I mean, I do think the city's interested in looking at the operational, like, the routes and things like that. I guess my other question is, the city did the transit master plan in 2018. I mean, it's only a few years old. I mean, they went through this whole process to look at those exact questions.
But they did.
Came up with a new plan.
What's changed?
And it's only a few years old, so why, if we're basically saying, well, we don't think that plan answered these questions, okay, fair enough, but why did it not? And are we gonna go through the same process and have the same result? Like, why was that a failed process? And if so, what would be done differently this time? Because I don't want to spend this much money, and in 4 or 5 years, people say, I don't think we've looked at the routes system in the way that it should be.
I mean, I will say that I do think there are like very pressing, important questions around transit and its intersections with affordable housing and other things like early childhood and grocery stores and workplace, areas where there's a higher density of employees going to. So it does feel like there are very pressing questions around transit and access in front of us as a community. And I would share the reservations about appropriating this level of funding into a feasibility study if it wasn't sort of laser focused on, and we had full alignment with the city going into it on exactly the questions that we're looking at. As you know, you kind of scan what's happening in some other communities, there's interesting stuff happening around like rideshare, fleets being deployed in parallel to buses, and kind of looking at offering different kinds of options to folks, especially people who rely on this for, getting to work on time in the morning. And so I guess, that's the piece that I was hoping the conversation would head in the direction of, is what are viable approaches we could pilot beyond just the very capital intensive costs of bringing new buses online and increasing the frequency of those routes and extending those routes, which may be a fit in some corridors, but my great sense, just from what I hear from people who are trying to utilize public transportation, is that even if we invested more money than we probably ever could in that, it would not address the real-time needs that most folks have when they're seeking public transportation. And, to me, the other piece that sort of rises to the top in terms of considerations on this is how what we do around transit aligns with where we're heading around affordable housing development. And we're heading into this window where we're poised to invest significantly in creating affordable housing and I'd be very interested in how this conversation can be married to that one. So I'm not averse to investing resources in us getting to good, understanding better how to respond to what the community's needed, but I am concerned that a process that's sort of already oriented towards this assumption that what the solution will rest in the form of more buses, more routes, et cetera, it misses some opportunities that are there around innovation and looking at other approaches we could be taking.
I'll echo that. I'm also interested in, as Brian mentioned, the governance structure there. That's worth considering, I think, at this point. And to Jasmine's point, we have a comp plan coming out and a lot of work being done by our planning folks that will inform what this could look like. So as long as we're all on the same page between city and county about that, that would put my mind at ease a little bit. But I think there are operational concerns that Al mentioned that would be extremely critical in us doing something that would be worthwhile and effective for vulnerable parts of our community and those who want to take public transit and just would not get to work on time if they took it.
I appreciate Commissioner Beach-Ferrara's comments specifically around affordable housing. I know that's something that we discuss regularly as part of that committee. My greater concern is if we are going to invest in this, that we ensure that we get out of it what we anticipate getting out of it versus a 2018 study that seems like nothing has been done with. So just really want to echo, let's make sure if we invest in this that we have very clear goals and expectations around what we want to receive for our $200,000 investment.
One thing I hear is clarifying whether we are in perfect alignment with the city, not just on what the elements of this feasibility study would be, but on what happens after the feasibility study, which is really the heart of the matter. Is this going to get us to a springboard for which there will be a context for joint action moving forward? Or is this going to get us to an impasse where we're kind of stuck? So that feels like one important piece. And I think, to me, at least, everything else flows from there. Yeah, I guess that's all I've got.
It's good discussion. I think for myself, I'm glad we've had some of the conversations with the city officials because I think it's kind of highlighted some areas that we potentially may not be on the same page. I mean, I remain open to this, but I would like to, for myself, I'd like to just have some more conversations with our city colleagues to just kind of talk those issues through and kind of see, like, are we really kind of thinking about this in ways that are so different? It may not be, a good fit because we might not have the right shared assumptions going into it, or perhaps we could bridge some of those and kind of get more on the same page. So I don't know, for myself, I'm not prepared to say I'm for it or not for it today. I think it just needs a little more, we need some more conversations to think these issues through to.
And what I wanted to be clear on was the money stays in the budget so we can forward those conversations and invest it. So that's what I wanted to make sure the conversation today. If you were pulling it, I would need to know that, and if you're going to keep
Yeah,
it.
I'm not proposing to pull it.
Okay.
Not yet.
So as we get draft scopes, we will share that to make sure that the scope is aligned with where you're looking, so. We'll make sure we share scope.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Were there any other topics that we've shared in all the other sessions that we need to make sure we clarify or talk about today?
This is related. Can we at some point, when the data is available, get an update on the remaining ARPA funds and maybe some staff recommendations or thoughts around
Yes.
how we move forward with those? It would just be helpful to think about that bucket of funding relative to the budget as we move forward. Thank you.
Maybe just one other question on the transit study issue. I've shared with the city officials that have talked to me about it, the question around the sales tax, because I do think that originally that was kind of a big impetus around all this. It's like, oh, let's do this study and let's show what's possible, and then it'll build on some momentum for doing a countywide quarter-cent sales tax increase approved by the voters. And I've just shared, not necessarily against it, but just sort of my skepticism that that's something that would win countywide voter approval, just to increase transit services. And, but I guess I just want to, I don't want to share perspective if that's not kind of the thinking of the larger commission. When we looked at the conservation bonds and the affordable housing bonds, we went through a pretty in-depth process to really look at that. What would be the purpose of it? Is this something that we think is politically viable? Partnering with Trust for Public Land, they did a lot of research around kind of the community's willingness to vote for these investments, and it was a really good process, which obviously led to a great result and good program. So there hasn't been any such process like that for the sales tax. So what I've been relaying is just more of my gut level concerns or kind of thinking around it. But I just wanted to see if any other commissioners have a different perspective, or if there is support for kind of looking at a sales tax referendum. Because if there's not, then I do think that would be helpful for the city officials to know that we don't see that as being something that's like a near-term likely initiative that would be
Ronnie,
out there.
I think one of the hurdles you have with the tax for the transportation system is the past history of what the city has done. And it's just the 2018, look at that study. And as you go back, they've talked about transportation for as long as I can remember, but they don't do anything. The public has not seen results. And you might have problems getting support on that in the city, let alone in the county.
I agree with your gut reaction. I don't think that the sales tax is a good idea at this time. I don't think that it's really feasible to proceed with that at this time.
I generally have significant concerns around sales tax in terms of their disproportionate impact on lower income folks, so I would have a lot of hesitancy.
I'm not in support either, particularly having, some of those areas further into the county where public transportation doesn't reach. I would hate asking folks to support something that, isn't going to directly benefit their day-to-day in this. And doesn't appear to have that opportunity coming down the pipe at any time in the near future either.
Okay, just wanted to have a chance to kind of talk that through, because I think that has been a part of the city's question about, well, is that a possibility? So just wanted to get some feedback. Any other comments on that?
No, I think the timing would be a little bit off at the present time. And yeah, just thinking about the outermost western parts of our county, might have some reservations about that.
I guess I'll just cabin that by saying I'm not averse to conversations about partnership and And with that would mean funding implications, but I just, so it's not saying no to that, it's just this piece.
I agree. And so I think that's the important point, is that we need, if we do something together around studying improved service levels, we just need to realize that we would likely be going into that. If there's not the sales tax option, it would basically be, in our budget, we would need to plan to invest more funding into transit. And I agree with Commissioner Whiteside that, I think there's a lot of sense of like, hey, how have the services really changed for the better? But it is a very expensive service, right? The city actually spends more on transit than most other metro areas around North Carolina on a per capita basis. The city invests more in transit than most places, but it's just, with the population density of our community, I mean, it's just, it's challenging to provide very high service levels in a community with relatively low population density compared to, larger cities where you see transit systems that operate at a very different level of service to, but it's a different land use pattern that they have to work with. So, all right, thank you for letting me get back there for just a minute. From the staff, any other items we need to
Nope.
talk about this morning?
No, unless there's any other guidance that you want to give us as we move forward with finalizing, the intent would be on May 2nd, May 9th. Yeah, fire districts and education partners would come, so you'll hear from AB Tech, Asheville City Schools, and Buncombe County Schools. We also have, I believe, 5 fire districts that are currently asking for a tax increase, so you'll hear from those 5 fire districts as well. And then following after that, is there another? Budget message will be coming forward, so we will be looking to finalize any input, any things that you need to see us cut or add from our budget between the 9th and the 16th, when we have a finally balanced budget. So if there's anything you see in all the documents that we've given you to date, let us know if there's anything missing, anything that we need to add or decrease in our budget.
Avril, have you had any meetings or communication with the school officials around their planning process and the
That is
budget number that we?
That is scheduled starting tomorrow. So they first go to their board, and then we'll start asking to see what the board have approved and recommended, so we'll get an idea of if the 10 million meets the need or not.
Just to be clear, that 10 million was in addition to, so that's over and above last year's.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. And that 10 million is both Buncombe and Asheville, so it's not all going to one. Yeah.
All right. If there is no other questions at this time, I think we're ready to adjourn. So thanks, everyone, for being here this morning.